The wind slipped through every narrow alley of Southview, a neighborhood where even the streetlights couldn't chase away the darkness that loomed. Sergeant Nathan Reyes, a seasoned cop with a face carved by years in the field, moved slowly but deliberately through the night. At his side was Shadow, a fierce Malinois K9, his silent partner of 5 years. Tonight's mission sounded simple: assist the task force in apprehending a small-time drug gang. But from the moment they stepped into Alley 19, Nathan felt it. Something was off. That feeling only deepened when Shadow suddenly froze. Ears pricked, a low growl rising from his throat, an ancient survival instinct igniting like a spark in the dark. Movement ahead. Hold the formation, Nathan whispered into the radio. But the warning came too late. A single gunshot cracked the silence, sharp, cruel. Pain exploded in Nathan's chest like a hot blade. He staggered, then collapsed onto the freezing concrete. Blood spilling fast, angry, red, and unstoppable. Shadow roared. He lunged forward, feral and fearless. But the ambushers had already vanished into the shadows. Chaos hung heavy in the air. Nathan lay there, gasping for air. No backup, no response. Only one soul refused to leave his side. Shadow. The dog planted himself in front of Nathan's bleeding body, eyes blazing like fire. He barked, fierce, echoing, urgent, a warning, a cry for help. But the radio remained silent. All channels were dead. Then, something no one could have predicted happened. Shadow grabbed Nathan's duty belt in his teeth and pulled, hard. Inch by inch, he dragged his handler toward a small recess in the alley wall. The only possible cover from more incoming fire. He tore his throat raw doing it. But he didn't stop. And still, it wasn't enough. Run, find help, do something. In that strange, brilliant awareness only a dog could possess, Shadow understood. Standing guard wouldn't save him. So he left. He left, but not to abandon. To rescue. Shadow sprinted into the night like a ghost unleashed, racing past buildings, through red lights, until he reached the gates of the nearest police precinct. He clawed. He howled. He slammed his body into the door like a battering ram of fur and desperation. 7 minutes. That's all it took. 7 minutes later, a convoy of squad cars and ambulances stormed the alley. Nathan was rushed to the just in time. "We couldn't believe it," said Major Simons, his voice catching as he wrapped his arms around the small but unbreakable dog. If Shadow hadn't acted the way he did, Sergeant Reyes wouldn't have made it. The very next day, news spread across the entire state. AK-9 had done something no one trained it for. Something no one expected. It saved a man's life not because it was ordered to, but because it loved him. And in a quiet, unpretentious ceremony held in the precinct's courtyard, when Nathan Reyes, still wrapped in fresh bandages across his chest, knelt down and hugged Shadow. He whispered just one thing: "I don't know why you came back for me, but thank you for not leaving me." He wasn't supposed to survive that night. But Shadow never let go. That night, in the alley where everything went wrong, Nathan Reyes could no longer speak. His hands trembled, blood poured relentlessly from his side, and every breath felt heavier than the last. The alley had turned colder, darker, and impossibly still. Shadow, the brave Malinois K9, whimpered softly, nudging Nathan's shoulder, desperate to spark the last flicker of life left in his partner. His instinct screamed. Nathan was slipping away. No signal, no backup, no time left. Shadow knew, if he didn't act now, Nathan would die. He glanced back one final time, then took off into the night. 4 legs, one mission. He ran like lightning, cutting through the empty streets of Chicago. Faster than he'd ever moved in his life. In his mind, there was only one thing: save Nathan. Cold wind lashed against his body, slicing through fur and flesh. But Shadow didn't care. Every second lost brought death one step closer to the only human that ever truly mattered to him. Flickering streetlights, trash bins, potholes, alleys. They were nothing more than obstacles, and Shadow blurred past them like a phantom. His ears alert, eyes scanning, heart racing. And then, he caught it. A scent. Familiar. Officer Elijah Harris, Nathan's oldest friend. The only other person Shadow trusted without question. Without hesitation, Shadow pivoted and charged toward the source. Harris had just stepped out of his patrol car, still listening to dispatch updates when. Shadow? What the hell? Before he could react, something yanked him forward hard. Shadow had clamped down on his sleeve, his eyes burning with urgency and fire. What's going on? Where's Nathan? There was no time for barks or signals. Shadow let out one sharp growl, then yanked again on the sleeve, his eyes pleading, but unyielding. Follow me, now. Years of field training kicked in. Officer Elijah Harris knew instantly, this wasn't random behavior. This was a distress call. Show me the way, buddy. Lead me there. No more words were needed. Shadow spun around and disappeared into the night, a living arrow slicing through the dark. Harris sprinted behind him, boots pounding pavement, heartbeat hammering in his chest. They weren't just running to find a wounded officer. They were running to wrestle a life from the grip of death. You don't get to leave me behind. You hear me, Nathan? Harris didn't hesitate. He grabbed his radio mid-run, breath ragged as his feet matched Shadow's relentless pace. Officer down. I repeat, officer down. Critical condition. Shadow just found me. We need EMS on site immediately. The dispatcher's voice came back like a heartbeat through the static. Copy. Unit 5. Location? West Alley, between Main and 14th. Send medics. Now. Shadow darted through the sleeping city, past alleyways, puddles, flickering street lamps. Nothing could slow him. Not fear. Not pain. Harris pushed his body to the limit. Lungs burning, not just from the chase, but from the terror of what they might find. And then, Shadow stopped. He froze at the mouth of a shadow-soaked alley. Harris followed his gaze, and felt his stomach drop. A streak of blood, leading to a body. Unmoving. Oh God! He rushed forward and dropped to his knees beside the man who had been his closest friend for years, Sergeant Nathan Reyes. Nathan's breathing was erratic, shallow. His chest barely rose. His eyes were open, but distant, unfocused. One hand was pressed to his side, blood still streaming through his fingers. His face had turned ashen, his lips, ghost pale. Nathan, look at me. Can you hear me? Harris pressed both hands on the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. The warmth of the blood soaked through his gloves, burning like fire. Every passing second felt like another inch Nathan was slipping away. Shadow paced in tight circles, ears pinned, whining in distress. He nudged Nathan's face with his nose, then licked his cheek gently, desperately. Nathan's lips parted, his voice, barely a whisper, broke through the silence. Did he make it back in time? Harris clenched his jaw, his throat thick with emotion. Yeah, Shadow found me. He brought me here. Shadow curled beside Nathan, and when he heard those words, he let out a soft whimper, almost like relief. Nathan gave a faint smile, thin as mist. Good boy? His eyelids began to close. No, damn it, Nathan, Harris shouted, gripping his friend's shoulders. Don't close your eyes. Help is coming. Stay with me. You don't get to leave me too. And then, the sound they'd been praying for. The rising wail of sirens, cutting through concrete. Closer, louder, urgent. Harris looked to Shadow, voice cracking. Hold him, don't let him drift. You've already saved him once. Shadow, just hold on a few minutes more. In the cold heart of a silent city, a soldier and a dog fought death, with the one weapon death could never understand. Unconditional love. And then, Shadow's ears shot up. His entire body stiffened, muscles locked. He stared into the darkness ahead, unmoving. Harris pulled his sidearm. The world went still. Someone's coming, he whispered. Was the gang returning to finish what they started? Shadow stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Nathan's motionless body and the approaching threat. His thick coat bristled. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep in his chest, like thunder just before a storm breaks. Then, footsteps. A shadow moved at the far end of the alley. Shadow growled louder, claws scratching the ground, his body taut, coiled like a spring about to snap. Chicago PD, we're back up. Lower your weapons, we're here to help. Harris exhaled, his body nearly collapsing under the weight of relief. Reinforcements, finally. Shadow slowly eased his stance. His tail dropped, but he didn't move. He remained planted beside Nathan, eyes locked on him like a silent vow. Paramedics flooded in like angels in a storm. One of them dropped to his knees beside Nathan. Massive blood loss, entry wound below the left rib. I tried to hold pressure. Harris rasped, backing away to give them space. His voice was hoarse, raw. The bleeding hadn't stopped. Shadow let out a sharp whine and tried to jump up on the stretcher, desperate to stay close. "Easy, buddy," Harris murmured, steadying the dog with a hand. "He's gonna be all right." IVs were hooked in. Gauze was wrapped tight around the wound. A medic called into the radio. "Patient critical but stable. Preparing for transport now." Shadow stood still, watching every motion. When they lifted Nathan onto the gurney, he let out a long, low whine, not from pain, but from helplessness. Not the cry of an animal. The cry of a friend. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The siren wailed. The vehicle surged into the night, taking with it a piece of Shadow's soul. Harris knelt beside the dog, running a hand over his still tensed back. "You did good, Shadow. No, you did something incredible." But Shadow didn't respond. He just stared after the van, eyes burning with waiting, loyalty, and something else. Fear. St. James Hospital, 2 a.m. Emergency lights pulsed overhead as Nathan's gurney flew through the doors. His face, ghostly pale. His breaths, thread thin. The team shouted orders, wheeling him straight into surgery. Outside the trauma unit, Shadow paced restlessly. His claws clicked on the tile floor. Ears perked. Every sound made him lift his head. Each time the doors opened, he looked up, hopeful. And then, let down again. Harris sat slumped on a plastic chair, his head against the wall. Exhausted, silent. But Shadow couldn't sit. He sniffed the floor. The lingering scent of blood. The sting of antiseptic. And most of all, Nathan's scent. Nathan wasn't safe yet. And until he was, Shadow would not rest. Time dragged on like a slow, cruel tide. Then, the doors swung open. A doctor stepped out, pulling down his surgical mask. His face was tired, but the fear was gone. Sergeant Reyes made it through surgery. The bullet caused serious damage. But he's stable now. Harris let out a shaky breath, nearly collapsing from relief. "Can I see him?" The doctor glanced at Shadow, hesitating. "And, the dog?" "He's not leaving," Harris said firmly. "Shadow's not just a dog. He's Nathan's partner. He stays until his friend wakes up." A pause. Then, a nod. "All right, but keep him calm." As soon as the door cracked open, Shadow shot through it, a living arrow. He tore down the hallway, nose flaring, chasing the only scent that had ever truly mattered to him. The scent of the man he was born to protect. Inside the ICU, silence ruled. Dim lights cast a pale glow over Nathan Reyes's colorless skin. He lay motionless, tangled in wires and tubes. Machines blinking red and green like cold city lights. An oxygen mask covered most of his face. Only his eyes, closed, and a breath, barely visible, reminded anyone that he was still alive. But barely. Slow. Faint. Like life itself was flickering. Shadow leapt softly onto the edge of the bed, placing both front paws firmly on the crisp white sheet. He lowered his head, nose touching Nathan's hand. The scent of blood had faded. But Nathan's own scent was fading too. Shadow inhaled deep, then let out a low, trembling whine. No one had taught him how to fear. But his heart knew. "Nathan?" Harris whispered, dragging a chair close to the bed. He looked at the two warriors, one still, one steadfast, and swallowed hard. "You've got the most stubborn partner I've ever seen. You know that?" Shadow didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't blink. He simply rested his head on Nathan's arm, quietly saying, "I'm here. I'm still here." The only sound was the slow beeping of the heart monitor. In that half-lit room, time forgot to move. Harris leaned back in the chair, exhaled, and gripped his now cold cup of coffee. "Looks like we wait. Huh, buddy?" But Shadow didn't tire. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He didn't ask for comfort. He stayed, watching, waiting, guarding, hour after hour, a test of loyalty carved in silence. No one told Shadow to stay. But he did. A nurse once tried to coax him out. Shadow didn't snarl, but he dropped his body low, locked eyes with her, and let out a deep, warning growl, like thunder rumbling in the belly of a storm. "This is my place. This is my human." No one tried again. And beneath the flickering ICU lights, that image became a wordless anthem. A dark furred dog, lying still beside the man he had nearly lost. Not out of duty, but out of love. Pure, fierce, Unbreakable. Shadow didn't leave. Not while Nathan's eyes stayed closed. Not while each breath felt like it could be the last. Not until his soul came back. Not now. Not ever. Harris gave a soft chuckle, shaking his head as he glanced over. Shadow still lay motionless, head resting gently on Nathan's arm, like a living statue. "You're one hell of a partner, kid." Shadow didn't answer. Only his ears flicked slightly. Then fell still again, waiting, watching, guarding. In the deep dark of unconsciousness, Nathan drifted. No pain, no sirens, no gunfire, just silence, as if he were lost in a fog-covered ocean. No waves, no stars, no shore, no direction, no reason to keep going. And then, a sound, distant, distorted, a voice, like it was echoing through water. He couldn't make it out. Not at first, but then, something familiar. Something warm, a low whine, worried. Shadow. The name didn't need to be said aloud. It lived inside Nathan like his own heartbeat. He tried to move. A finger, a breath, anything, nothing. His body was chained in a void he couldn't break. He wanted to scream, but couldn't. He was sinking, deeper, colder, further, until a light, faint, not ahead, behind, calling him back. Not a command, not a demand, just love, unconditional. In that endless dark, a heartbeat pulsed, faint, but real. Nathan's mind trembled, and for the first time in hours, his finger twitched. A voice from the past, a touch from the present, a promise never broken, a memory cut through the fog like lightning. Shadow, a young K9 recruit, barely a year old, his brown eyes full of innocence and fire. Standing tall, waiting for his first command. Nathan Reyes knelt beside him, ran a hand over the velvet soft coat, and smiled. "We're gonna be a great team, kid." Another memory rushed in, a night patrol, an empty street. Shadow trotted at his side, ears perked, senses alive. The first time Shadow saved Nathan's life. He took down a suspect seconds before the man could stab Nathan from behind. And then, the alley, the gunshot, the searing pain, the darkness, a sharp, broken whine, pulled him back. Nathan fought against the brutal force dragging him away from reality. Fought through the thick fog clouding his mind. No, he wasn't alone. Shadow was waiting, with every ounce of strength he had left. Nathan opened his eyes. Harris nearly dropped his coffee. Shadow's ears snapped forward. Nathan's finger twitched. The heart monitor picked up. Slow, but steady. His breath, fragile, but growing stronger. "Nathan?" Harris leaned in, voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" Nathan's eyelids fluttered. His throat moved as he swallowed. And then, a whisper. Barely more than air. "Shadow." Shadow let out a high, sudden bark. A burst of joy after endless silence. "That's right, kid," Harris said, smiling through eyes that shimmered red. "Shadow never left you." Shadow pressed his nose against Nathan's hand. His tail gave a slow, steady wag. His partner was still alive. Nathan looked down, his voice hoarse, cracked, but alive. "Saving me again, huh, buddy?" Shadow gently licked his hand, his warm brown eyes glowing with quiet joy. Harris shook his head, chuckling softly. "Yeah, and this time, he dragged me across half the city to do it," Harris said with a chuckle. Nathan let out a weak laugh. Faint, but real. He turned his head, locking eyes with Shadow. No words were needed. The bond between them ran deeper than language. Shadow had done the impossible. He had brought Nathan back. The days that followed were slow, but healing. The bullet had torn through muscle, but missed every major organ. The doctors called it a miracle. But Nathan didn't. "It wasn't a miracle," he said softly. "It was Shadow." The Malinois never left his side. Not even after Nathan was moved to a recovery room. Fellow officers came by with flowers, jokes, and warm words. But only Shadow stayed through every hour. Every minute. Every second. One night, with darkness pooling beyond the hospital windows, Nathan lay still, staring up at the ceiling. The pain had dulled, but something else remained. A deeper ache. A shadow in the mind. "I should have seen it coming," he whispered. Shadow lifted his head, ears flicking at the sound. Harris, half asleep in a nearby chair, stirred. "What?" Nathan exhaled, jaw tightening. That shooter. I should have sensed something was off. I let my guard down. Harris sat up fully, voice steady. Don't do that. You're one of the best cops I know. And Shadow, he knew. He got there in time. You're still breathing. Nathan looked down at the dog beside him. His hand moved slowly, brushing the soft fur. Yeah, you're right. Shadow nudged his head into Nathan's palm, eyes warm, saying, whatever happens, I'm not leaving. Harris leaned back, sipping from a lukewarm cup of coffee. You're still trying to make this your fault? He glanced at Shadow. You survived. And Shadow, I think he just earned Officer of the Year. Nathan let out a low laugh. No doubt about it. Shadow's tail gave a slow wag. In that stark white room, everything felt still, just the heartbeat on the monitor, and the soft hum of wind whispering through the window gap. 3 days had passed since Nathan woke. The pain in his body was fading, but the battle in his mind wasn't over. Shadow stayed. No sleep, no distraction, no distance, because he knew his partner was still fighting. The door creaked open. Harris stepped inside, exhaling a long breath. Whole precinct's asking about you, he said with a small smile, placing a fresh coffee on the side table. And everyone wants to throw a party for Shadow. At the sound of his name, Shadow's ears perked, but he didn't move from his spot, his head still resting on Nathan's hand. His eyes fixed. They're even talking about giving him a medal, Harris added, tilting his chin toward the dog. Nathan reached up, scratching gently behind Shadow's ear. The dog let out a soft, contented sigh, as if the entire world no longer mattered. So long as Nathan was still breathing. He doesn't care about medals. Nathan whispered, voice fading into the morning light. He just wants to know I'm still here. Harris nodded, sinking into the chair beside the bed. He rubbed his face with both hands. Yeah, well, so do we. He murmured, his voice heavy with something unspoken. Nathan went quiet. The alley returned, sharper than memory, slower than time. That night, how bad was it, really? He asked, eyes locked on the ceiling. Harris didn't answer at first. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, as if the weight of that night still lived on his shoulders. Finally, he looked up. If Shadow hadn't found me, you wouldn't be here. Nathan already knew that truth, but hearing it aloud, it hit like a hammer. That night, when the lights faded and the sirens screamed into the void, he truly believed he was going to die. And maybe, if it hadn't been for Shadow. Night had fallen. Nathan lay awake, eyes fixed on the pristine white ceiling. The painkillers had dulled the ache in his ribs, but they couldn't quiet the storm in his head. He rewound every second in that alley. The gunshot, the blood, the icy chill as life drained from his body. And then, Shadow's eyes, as if sensing Nathan's unrest. Shadow lifted his head, watching him. No words needed. You knew, didn't you? Nathan whispered, running his hand through the thick, warm fur. You felt it, before I even had a clue. Shadow didn't move, just let out a soft whine, as if to say, I warned you. I should have listened to you. Shadow nudged his hand gently, as if pushing the guilt away, one quiet breath at a time. Nathan gave a tired chuckle. You really don't let me beat myself up, huh? Shadow licked his hand once, then rested his head back on Nathan's arm, right where he belonged. The next morning, soft sunlight filtered through frosted glass. A young doctor entered with a clipboard in hand. Your recovery is progressing very well, she said, flipping through a few pages. If everything stays on track, you could be discharged in a few days. Nathan nodded, though his gaze remained distant. As the door clicked shut, Harris appeared, fresh coffee in hand. Nathan looked up, no pretense in his voice. I need to go back to work. Harris nearly choked. Come again? As soon as I'm cleared. I want to be back on duty. The longer you stay away, the harder it is to come back. Harris let out a dry, incredulous laugh. You got shot less than a week ago. Man, you don't need to be a hero. You need to rest. Nathan shook his head. I'm not built for sitting still. That's hell for me. Harris stared at him, then sighed. I get it. Just don't push too fast. Your head and your body still need time. Nathan looked down at Shadow. You're right. My head's still in the fight. Without another word, Harris handed him the coffee, then took a seat beside the bed. Shadow let out a soft breath, curling tighter next to Nathan, ears still alert, As if sleep were never really an option. He was still the protector. Still the barrier between Nathan and the dark. 1 week later, Nathan sat on the edge of the hospital bed, rotating his shoulders slowly. The stitches still pulled tight. The pain still lingered, but it was pain he could handle now. Doctors said to wait another week before any light movement. But Nathan had never been good at waiting. And this time, he wasn't rising just for himself. He stood, because beside him was a four-legged soul who had never left his side. Shadow sat directly in front of Nathan. Deep brown eyes locked in unwavering focus. Not a single blink wasted. Not a breath out of sync. He knew what was about to happen. Harris leaned against the doorway. Arms crossed. "You sure you want to do this?" Nathan glanced up, calm but resolute. "I have to." He took a deep breath. Then slowly placed his feet on the cold tile floor. His legs trembled slightly, the weight pressing down on barely healed wounds. And the moment he faltered, Shadow moved in, steadying beside him, his body like a wall of muscle and warmth. Nathan bent down, fingers curling into the fur at Shadow's neck. A silent anchor. A quiet promise. "I'm not walking alone." Harris shook his head, grinning. "You two? You were made for each other." Nathan smirked. "Yeah, and he's more stubborn than I am." Shadow snorted softly, as if to say, "You're damn right I am." The first steps were slow. Cautious. The pain was still there, dull but undeniable. A reminder that he wasn't fully healed. But Shadow never left his side. Each movement was matched perfectly. As if they'd practiced this dance all their lives. This wasn't just about healing the body. This was about reclaiming trust. The last time Nathan stood, he'd collapsed into cold concrete. The last time he walked, it had nearly been his final step. Now, every movement whispered a vow. "I'm coming back." They reached the doorway. Harris opened it. Light spilled in from the hallway beyond. "You ready to see the world again?" Nathan nodded, exhaling slow. "Yeah, let's do this." Shadow stepped forward, ears perked, tail swaying gently. His partner had risen once again. And that could only mean one thing. They were going back to where they belonged. Together. Nathan stepped out of the hospital. Shoulders rising and falling with every breath. The cool Chicago air kissed his skin, sending a small shiver down his spine. Not the bitter cold of the night he was shot, but enough to stir the memories that had settled deep within him. Shadow walked in sync at his side, his sturdy frame brushing gently against Nathan's leg. Every step measured, sharp, steady, just like on patrol. No one had taught Shadow to do that. He chose to stay. He chose to walk beside him. He chose to be the anchor that kept Nathan from drifting back into the dark. Harris walked a few paces behind, eyes never leaving Nathan. "You sure about this?" he asked softly. Nathan let out a breath, his gaze fixed far ahead. I need to feel normal again." Normal, a word that used to feel so simple, now felt distant, almost unreachable. Not just because of the wounds on his body, but because of the helplessness he'd felt. Lying there, bleeding, unable to move, unable to protect himself. He'd always been the one to step forward, to lead, to protect. But that night, he'd gone down. And Shadow hadn't let him stay down. As if sensing that thought, Shadow gently bumped his nose against Nathan's hand, pulling him back to the present. Harris smiled. "Take it slow. And if it gets too much, you know." Nathan cut in, voice quiet but firm. "Shadow will know." Harris nodded, not pushing it. "Yeah, he always does." They reached the parking lot. Nathan's patrol car, restored, cleaned, repaired, sat quietly, like a silent witness to everything they'd endured. As they drew closer, Nathan caught his reflection in the side mirror. He looked tired, thinner, different, but he was still standing. Shadow sat beside him, watching, waiting. "You don't have to rush this," Harris said gently. Nathan placed his hand on the driver's side door. Took a long, slow breath. "I just want to feel like I'm still human." Harris didn't answer. He simply handed Nathan a cup of coffee and sat down beside him. Shadow exhaled, then curled up at Nathan's feet. His form steady, grounded, calm. He wasn't just a partner. He was a protector, a guardian between light and shadow. And when the time came, he would rise again, right beside him. He would stand again, once more, beside Nathan. Nathan Reyes sat at the edge of his hospital bed, slowly rotating his shoulder. The stitches still pulled beneath his skin, and each movement sent a sharp reminder rippling through his ribs. But pain, he could live with that. It was the kind of pain that came from healing, not the pain of helplessness like that night. The doctors said he needed at least another week before even thinking about light activity. But Nathan had never been good at sitting still. Across the room, Shadow sat silently. His deep brown eyes tracked every movement. Focused, precise, as if he were back on duty. He knew something was about to happen. Harris leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You sure you want to do this?" Nathan glanced at him, no hesitation in his gaze. "I have to." He took a deep breath and placed his feet on the cold tile floor. His body dipped slightly under its own weight. The moment he faltered, Shadow moved in, pressing close to his leg. A living pillar of strength. Nathan reached down, fingers curling into the thick fur at Shadow's neck, seeking balance, reassurance. Harris watched, shaking his head gently. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Nathan gave a tired smile. "He's worse than me." Shadow let out a soft huff. A quiet, proud confirmation. The first steps were slow, but steady. Each one pulled at his ribs, stirring echoes of pain and memory. But Shadow stayed beside him, step for step, in perfect sync, as if they'd never missed a beat. This wasn't just recovery. This was reclamation, of purpose, of trust, of control. The last time Nathan had stood up, he'd bled out onto cold concrete. The last time he'd walked, it had nearly been his last. Now, each step whispered a silent promise. "I'm coming back." They reached the door. Harris opened it. "You ready to see the world again?" Nathan exhaled slowly. "Yeah, let's do this." Shadow stepped out first, ears alert, tail swaying gently. His partner had risen again, which could only mean one thing. Their journey wasn't over. Nathan took a breath as he crossed the hospital threshold. The cool Chicago air skimmed across his skin, raising goosebumps. Not the cutting cold of that deadly night, but cold enough to remind him he was still here. Shadow walked at his side, his solid frame brushing against Nathan's leg. A reflex burned into instinct. No leash, no command. He knew where to be and what to do. Harris walked alongside them, his eyes on Nathan. "You sure about this?" Nathan nodded, eyes distant. "I just need to feel human again." Human. The word felt strange now, almost foreign. After everything, after nearly dying, after losing all control, even that simplest idea felt fragile. He wasn't just healing from a bullet. He was healing from the loss of power, the loss of identity, the terrifying moment when the protector became the one needing protection. That night, he hadn't been able to do a damn thing for himself. And if it hadn't been for Shadow. The dog nudged Nathan's hand gently again, pulling him from the spiral of thoughts. Harris spoke softly. "Take it slow. If it gets too much, just..." Nathan cut him off with a faint smile. "Shadow already told me." Harris chuckled, nodding. "Exactly. He always does." They stepped down from the hospital entrance, moving toward the parking lot. Nathan's old patrol car, now repaired, sat under the soft morning sun like a quiet memory of everything that had happened. As they approached, Nathan caught his reflection in the window. He wasn't the same man who'd pulled endless night shifts without blinking. He was someone who had been through something that would change him, forever. Shadow sat beside him, steady and calm, as if to say, "No matter who you are now, I'm still here." Harris reminded him gently, "You don't have to rush this." Nathan placed a hand on the door handle, eyes steady. "I just need to feel like myself again." He opened the door. The familiar scent of worn leather, cold coffee, and dog hair rushed up to greet him, like time hadn't moved at all. The tightness from the stitches was still there, but he ignored it. He slid into the driver's seat. Shadow jumped up into the passenger seat, his usual post for every long patrol night. Nathan rested his hand on the wheel, fingers brushing over the worn grooves. Harris leaned against the door. "You know you're not cleared to drive, right?" Nathan gave a raspy chuckle. "I know." Shadow let out a quiet breath, as if saying, "Just sitting here is enough." They sat in silence. Nathan closed his eyes, and for a moment, he just listened to the steady breathing beside him. That breath had been with him through darkness, blood, and the edge of death, and never once had it wavered. Harris tapped gently on the roof of the car. All right, you've had your moment. Let's get back inside before the doctors chew me out. Nathan nodded. Slowly, he stood, opened the door. Shadow hopped out at the same time, falling into step beside him as they made their way back toward the hospital. It wasn't time to return to duty. Not yet. But this was the first step. The first step. Back to himself. As Nathan Reyes and Shadow walked through the hospital lobby, a few nurses paused to watch. Some of them had been there the night he was wheeled into the ICU. Unconscious, barely breathing, clinging to life by a single, fragile thread. Now, seeing him walk slowly beside Shadow, they couldn't help but smile. Whispers passed between them, soft, emotional, as if witnessing a real-life miracle. A young nurse, Emily, stepped forward, her voice as light as the morning sun. Sergeant Reyes, it's really good to see you walking again. Nathan nodded slightly, a small smile touching the edge of his lips. Feels damn good to do it on my own. Emily looked down and smiled at Shadow. And how about you, Shadow? You know you're kind of famous around here, right? Shadow gave a gentle tail wag, but his face remained composed and serious. As always. Emily laughed softly. Guess the spotlight doesn't faze a real warrior. Huh? Harris chuckled. Nah, he's all business. Always has been. They continued down the hall, toward Nathan's room, but just as they reached the door, a familiar figure stepped into view. Captain Reynolds. His face bore the marks of decades in the force. He was the kind of man everyone at the precinct respected, not for the bars on his shoulders, but for the unshakable integrity that radiated from his every word and action. Nathan stood upright the moment he saw him, pure instinct. Reynolds gave him a once-over, then let his gaze fall to Shadow. Heard you're walking again. Yes, sir, Nathan replied. The captain nodded slowly. Good, because as soon as the doctors clear you, I want you and Shadow back with the team. Nathan blinked, surprised. I thought you'd put me on desk duty. Reynolds offered a faint smile, half amusement, half challenge. Reyes, I know you. Put you behind a desk and you'd go insane. You belong in the field. And Shadow. His eyes flicked to the dog standing silently at Nathan's side. He's already proven he's worth more than half our squad combined. Harris let out a soft laugh. I'd say more than half. Reynolds didn't even acknowledge the jab. He just gave a firm nod. I'm not pushing you. But when you're ready, your spot's waiting. Something inside Nathan loosened. A pressure that had weighed on his chest for days now, suddenly lifted. Thank you, sir. Reynolds turned to go, then paused at the doorway. Oh, and Reyes? Yes, sir. When you're back on duty, you might want to swing by City Hall. Word is, Shadow's about to receive a commendation. Harris let out a low whistle. You hear that, buddy? You're about to be famous. Shadow didn't react, except for a slow, steady tail wag, but his eyes never left Nathan. Not even for a second. Once Reynolds had gone, Harris gave Nathan a light slap on the shoulder. Looks like you're not the only hero around here. Nathan reached down, running his hand across Shadow's head. He's always been the hero. With or without a medal. Shadow rested his head on Nathan's hand, eyes glowing with something deeper than loyalty, something more like quiet, unwavering love. The days that followed moved slowly. Each one brought Nathan a little closer to full recovery. The medical staff no longer looked at him like a fragile patient. They started calling him by rank again, Sergeant. But in their eyes, there was still something else, something reverent. Like they were looking at a man who had come back from the dead. Shadow never left his side. Every time Nathan practiced walking again, breathing deep, stretching out the tightness in his shoulders, Shadow's eyes tracked his every movement. Unblinking, not just watching, guarding. Harris stopped by every morning, always with a fresh cup of coffee in hand. He brought news from the precinct, and the kind of loaded glances that hinted at a return to duty. They're hunting that gang across the entire city. The ones from that night. He sipped his coffee, then added, oh, and the public? They're talking about Shadow like he's already a legend. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Harris scrolled through his phone, smirking as he read a headline aloud. Lone K9 sprints through the night to save his partner. Chicago's four-legged warrior. You should really see this. Nathan let out a quiet laugh. Shadow just exhaled, long and low, as if he'd grown used to people talking about him. But to Nathan, Shadow didn't need headlines, didn't need medals. In his eyes, Shadow was already a living shield, a soul bound to his own. Even if Nathan wasn't ready to return, Shadow had been ready long before. Harris looked up from his screen, raising an eyebrow. Every news outlet wants to interview the dog who saved his partner's life. Nathan Reyes chuckled, glancing toward Shadow. You ready to be a celebrity, buddy? Shadow blinked slowly, indifferent. Fame meant nothing to him. Nathan, alive and breathing, was all that ever mattered. That weekend, Dr. Patel finally delivered the words Nathan had been waiting days to hear. You'll still need regular physical therapy. And take it easy, but you're cleared to go home. Home. The word echoed in Nathan's chest, both distant and achingly familiar. He hadn't stepped foot there since the night he was shot. The night that was almost his last. Harris clapped a hand on his shoulder, smirking. Guess that makes me your personal chauffeur today. Nathan gave a faint smile. Better than calling a cab. Immediately, Shadow perked up, ears raised, head tilted, his body tensed, just slightly, as if he had picked up on something profound. He knew. His partner was going home. The drive home was silent. No music, no words, only the steady rhythm of the tires and the weight of memory pressing down on Nathan's chest. He had almost died. If Shadow hadn't run into the night. If Harris hadn't gotten there in time. He wouldn't be sitting here now, watching the city blur past through the window, hazy like a dream he barely escaped. Shadow sat in the backseat, head tilted forward between the front seats, his deep brown eyes fixed on Nathan, not blinking, not wavering. When the car stopped in front of his house, Harris glanced over. Good? Nathan exhaled, nodding softly. Yeah, the house looked the same. But he didn't. He stepped out, legs still slightly unsteady. Shadow was right there, pressed close, his body a living barrier. No leash, no commands. They only needed each other. Nathan unlocked the door, and as always, Shadow went in first. He swept through the place with quiet urgency, nose to the ground, checking every room like it was routine patrol. 1 lap, 2. Then, finally, he returned to Nathan, lifted his head, and let out a soft huff. It's clear. You're safe. You're home. Harris leaned against the doorframe. You need anything? Nathan shook his head, voice low. I just need a little time. All right, but you know who to call. Then Harris turned and left. And for the first time in weeks, Nathan was truly alone. He sank onto the couch, his hand finding Shadow's back. The dog looked up and gave his hand a gentle nudge. Nathan dropped to one knee and pulled his partner close. Not just a dog, not just a K9. His protector, his lifeline. We did it, buddy. Shadow licked his cheek in quiet reply. They were home, together. The next morning, Nathan stood in front of the precinct, breathing in the sharp Chicago air. It cut through his lungs like ice, awakening parts of him that had felt dead for days. Beside him, Shadow sat stone still, ears perked, eyes forward, focused. Today was the day. Nathan bent down, placed a hand on Shadow's head. You ready to go back, partner? A single wag of the tail. No words needed. The answer was always yes. They stepped inside. The precinct didn't erupt in applause. There were no balloons, no banners, just silence and respect. One officer gave a small nod, then another. Then the whole room followed, some with smiles, some with quiet stares. But every look said the same thing. You're back, and you were never alone. With Shadow beside him, Nathan Reyes was unstoppable. If you were moved by Nathan and Shadow's journey, hit subscribe to never miss powerful, real-life stories of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their four-legged partners. Every subscription is a show of support that helps us keep sharing these deeply human moments with the world. Turn on the notification bell so you're the first to see what's next.